So good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you all here in Barcelona. I'm hoping many more people will come from the breaks to attend this fantastic session. So I'm Pascal.
Maybe shout magic mushrooms into the auditorium and see if that works.
I didn't want to. Thank you, Adrienne.
You should.
Magic mushrooms. Let's see. So my name is Pascal Joncour. I'm your host for today. I'm a venture capital investor, partner at Convergence, and I'm also specifically interested in brain and mental health. Hence my keen interest on psychedelics. And I'm joined today by a fantastic panel, so I suggest everybody just introduce themselves in a timely, quick manner to get started.
Me?
Óscar, please.
Thank you. Bona tarda a tothom. Good afternoon. I'm representing two institutions, two different companies. One is Clinica Synaptica. Clinica Synaptica is the first ketamine-assisted therapy clinic in Barcelona. We name it the first psychedelic-assisted therapy clinic in Barcelona, but nowadays we can only legally work with ketamine. We have been delivering our services for the last 3 years. We have treated almost 320 people. And we are not only interested in the clinical work itself with patients, we also love working with trainings, with research, so spreading the word. And the second institution I'm representing is the ICEERS Foundation. The ICEERS stands for the International Center for Ethnobotanical Education, Research and Services. Sorry for that. And we focus on transforming society's relation with traditional ethnobotanicals, mainly ayahuasca, ibogaine, and cannabis. And we do that through the law and policy arena, through research and science, and through education and community development. Sorry, it was a bit long, but
no, thank you, Óscar. Thank you.
Thank you. Florian, co-founder and co-CEO of Atai Life Sciences, a clinical stage biotech company focused on developing innovative solutions in mental health, and started the company in 2018 as a direct response to the significant unmet need that I experienced myself through family members and close friends developing severe mental health disorders and not finding any kind of the appropriate care or help in the existing treatment options, and also witnessing kind of all the nasty side effects that a lot of the approved and first and second line, third line treatments currently have. So basically wanted to close that innovation gap, and that was my main driver to start Atai, focused on psychedelics to a large degree, have 6 compounds overall in the clinic right now, ranging from phase 1 to phase 3. And very excited to dig a little deeper in a second here.
Thanks, Florian.
Good afternoon, everyone. Adrienne Rivlin. I'm currently a partner at L.E.K Consulting, where I advise to the life sciences, primarily biopharma industry. My background is in academic medical science and specifically forensic psychiatry.
Thanks, Adrienne. Fantastic. So let's structure this discussion in 3 steps. So first, I'd like to talk about overall the paradigm shift in psychedelics. Then we'll talk a little bit more about the pipeline and the drug development. And then we'll talk mainly also about patients. How do we reach the patients down the line? And maybe to start, Óscar, my first question to you, we talk about this paradigm shift, and the title is the stigma fading? How are we shaking up mental health care? Can you perhaps give us a little bit of background why this happens now, and what are the dynamics?
yes, thanks. Actually, I love the title of this panel because ending the stigma is my main motivation in all this journey. And the stigma is directly linked to the legal situation of these substances. And if we talk to the legal situation, we have to talk of the war on drugs. I like beginning this explanation by saying that any conversation about the psychedelic renaissance, what is called this momentum we are living, that excludes the role of the war on drugs is either misinformed or has some hidden interest. Okay, the hidden interest are what have been driving drug prohibition, the drug war. The drug war is sold by nice words, but always driven by hidden interest. Okay, so we cannot avoid that, and because it's always in this conversation. But what really made this psychedelic issue famous, it was what it's named the pollen effect. The pollen effect is related to some scientific publications issued by Roland Griffiths back in 2006. he did some research about the mystical experiences related to the psilocybin consumption. So somehow this succeeded in gathering the attention of the major outlets, and because of this writer, Michael Pollan. Michael Pollan is a very famous writer in the US that writes about health, a lot of food, a lot of topics, and suddenly he brings to the attention of the general public this question, this matter of the mystical experience related to the mushrooms. So you could say that the scientific advancements is what have been fighting the stigma, but we could also say that it's that the war on drugs and the politics could not stop those through coming from the scientific arena, because those substances have been here for centuries. And this knowledge has been here since the 60s, since the 50s. We're actually in the third wave of this psychedelic renaissance, but most of the basis of these scientific advancements were done in the 50s, in the 60s, because of LSD, because of MDMA, because of these first generation compounds. So even it seems that this was invented in the US, it is not. Actually, in Europe, in the 90s and in the early 2000s, the basis of the scientific research regarding psychedelics was done in Germany, was done here in Catalonia specifically, in Switzerland, Dr. Franz Wollenbader, in the UK with Amanda Fielding. So it seems new, but it's not new. What it's new, it's this growing mental health crisis that we are facing, and the failure of psychopharmacology. So for 50 years, there had not been good advancements in psychopharmacology. There's an urgent need to cover this mental health crisis, and here is where psychedelics arrive. And the last one, my first argument, the failure of the war on drugs. First, cannabis, shown that the war on drugs makes no sense because cannabis is everywhere. In the US, cannabis is being legalized, also out of the US, in America. And the second element that shows that the war on drugs is a failure are psychedelics. No? Psychedelics have to be legalized because they have a lot of benefits, but the war on drugs has to be ended because it has a lot of non-intended consequences.
Thank you, Óscar. Very comprehensive overview, and I think the link to mental health is obviously one of the most fundamental, not only part of this discussion, but also because the staggering number of mental health patients worldwide. And if we look at this as a market, Adrienne, how do you see opportunities and dynamics in that market?
You know, we are really in the grip of an epidemic. It's not an infectious diseases epidemic, so maybe it doesn't get quite as much coverage from the media. But it's estimated that about 15% of us globally at any point in time is suffering from one or more mental health conditions. So that's 900 million to 1 billion individuals at any moment in time on the planet suffering, possibly unnecessarily. And as Óscar was saying, we really, really don't have a lot of therapies that work or work as well as they really need to. Mm-hmm. So the biggest, I think, point to make, from my perspective at least, is that we desperately, desperately need more therapies, whether they be medication related, so some of the things that Florian's working on, or more psychotherapeutic related, or some kind of a combination of the two, in order that we better address that significant health burden. My own background is in suicide and self-harm research, so when you think about 900 million to 1 billion people feeling miserable, grim, suicidal, self-harming, and you think about the mortality related to that, or even the morbidity, just not being able to go to work, and the lost productivity from that, it really is so significant. And one of the things that I think is so exciting about, and the promise of psychedelics, is really being able to address that. So from a market, so I always start with the patient perspective, but from a market perspective, which is I think your question, Pascal, if you are able to bring efficacious drugs, possibly in combination with a psychotherapeutic approach, and they work, healthcare systems do reward you for that. It is an absolute misconception that they will not, but that's a separate topic for discussion. If you bring things to market that work, you will be rewarded commercially, and you will be rewarded commercially well in pretty much any of the major jurisdictions.
Thank you, Adrienne. Thank you for highlighting the needs that we also see from a patient point of view. And if and we know they are breakthrough therapies, those psychedelic therapies. Question for you, Florian. Can you tell us a little bit more on what the industry is working on in terms of substances, molecules, modes of actions, and indications?
Yeah, I'm very happy to. So we are thinking about it, and you mentioned already kind of the first generation psychedelics. So we were thinking in kind of three buckets: first, second, and third generation compounds. The first generation compounds are basically synthetic versions of the compounds, as you pointed out, that have been around since a very long time. So that's LSD, psilocybin, and some other kind of more traditional 5-HT2A agonists. The second generation we refer to as molecules that are where we're tweaking the formulation in a way that we can optimize for scalability. So some of the first generation compounds like psilocybin or LSD kind of have a very long duration of effect. So that requires an in-clinic or a stay of 6 hours-ish in the case of psilocybin, up to 12 hours in the case of LSD. And we are trying with the second generation compounds to optimize for shorter duration stays to allow for greater accessibility for patients. So that's kind of how we think about the second generation. And we are specifically working on 5-MeO-DMT and DMT in this category in the depression space. And then the third generation compounds are completely de novo designed compounds that on the one side, when they're hallucinogenic, address some of the safety concerns, the 5-HT2B binding liability that is kind of associated with some cardiac risks. And when it comes to, the non-hallucinogenic compounds that are rooted in psychedelics, it gets to, can we actually achieve efficacy without having a psychedelic experience? I think we can debate this here on stage. I think you probably would have an opinion on this, but it's certainly an interesting hypothesis to explore. So we are also working on this, but these are kind of the three buckets. In terms of indication, it's really mental health heavy. So depression, anxiety, substance use disorder. There are some exploratory studies also looking at neurology, pain, so adjacent indications, but the primary indication space is really mental health indications currently.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Let's maybe take on Óscar on that, those differences between the different generations of psychedelics. I'm interested to maybe learn a little bit more and what the challenges are in terms of researching it and seeing their related impact.
Well, Florian explained it perfectly, so I just can add a few things. In regards to the differences between those legacy psychedelics and those new ones, which there's also this third, last one I will explain it briefly lastly, but we are mainly, I think, focusing on the first generation is the ones that I mentioned, LSD, MDMA, mescaline, all this. And then the second generation is mostly, I think, 5-MeO-DMT or DMT itself. So I don't know if you are aware of where does it come from or the history of these compounds, but one of the main differences is what he said. The effects last shorter. Okay, we are talking about an experience that lasts between 10 and 15 minutes compared to experiences that last 6, 8, or 12 hours. That makes it much easier to fit into the clinical space in terms of resources, accessibility. So a shorter effect, it has some nice opportunities, but also there are a lot of challenges. For example, 5-MeO-DMT, that in a natural form, it comes from these Bufo alvarius. This is the frog in the Sonoran Desert in Mexico. There's a sustainability issue, but we are lucky because this compound can be done synthetically in a lab. No? So in regards to the first generation, the second generations are more sustainable, which is interesting. And the effect of the substance, it's very difficult because the first generation, it brings us to somehow to the experience of connection, which is very needed for patients that are isolated. But the second generation, 5-MeO-DMT, it brings to the ego dissolution, which is nothing compared to connection, ego dissolution. So it's facing the death of your ego. So it's very interesting, no, in terms of the mystery of consciousness, what works better, what works less. And then they don't have the cultural background. The second generation and third generation, they don't have the cultural background. So they don't have the stigma. The first generation, magic mushrooms, magic mushrooms. This is something that science has struggled to deal with. Or MDMA, a party drug, or ketamine, the horse tranquilizer. So somehow for entrepreneurs and people investing, it's more interesting to invest in substances that do not have this cultural background, even though it's what doesn't, it interests me less because I want to dive into the cultural background. And yeah, and the third generation, it's very interesting because when they do molecular chemistry, they are developing compounds which they have less psychedelic effect, but they keep the neuroplasticity effect. So we really don't know what's the crucial element of these molecular compounds that work. What I know that work is the therapy catalyzed by these compounds, but the exact compound that can work better with each illness, we don't know. That's why we're doing this research.
Thank you, Óscar. And I think you're raising a very important point. We know that it works, and yet we have a lot of questions from regulators. And just in the recent past, we've got that rejection from the Lykos MDMA program on PTSD. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you, Florian, what are the challenges associated to that rejection for the industry? Do you start looking at how your trials are designed, or what are the immediate actions that you take away from that decision?
Yeah, and Adrienne and I were just in the before going on stage a little bit talking about this, and that I think Lykos is it's a very special case, and there are multiple factors I think that contributed to the advisory committee outcome. So there was an advisory committee that advised the FDA on whether it should be approved or not. There are a lot of experts in this room. Stigma also played a role there. So there were some professors, or I think a professor saying, if you approve MDMA now, what do they do next when they go home? Do they take cocaine? So there's still something of that also in the ecosystem, in the establishment, if you want. There's still the stigma, but I think there were essential, like some very objective shortcomings of the new drug application that were submitted, that is partially rooted in resource constraints. So they're non-profit for a very long time. Lykos or MAPS were non-profit. They didn't have access to the funds that larger pharmaceutical companies or also smaller pharmaceutical companies like us that have access to the financial markets to develop kind of well-designed large studies. And there's a lot more that we can dive into, but I think it's very idiosyncratic to that specific new drug application. For us, actually much more relevant is the approval of Spravato as ketamine. There was also an AdCom, there was an FDA approval in 2019 for a compound that is ketamine-like as a dissociative, but it has to be administered in a similar way. So in the clinic, under controlled, supervised, so very similar to how we envision to also administer our DMT program or 5-MeO program. And there was a favorable vote on this on the AdCom, and they basically closely collaborated with the FDA, and that's also our approach. There's an FDA clinical trial guideline specific to psychedelics that was released 1 year ago or 1.5 years ago, and we are closely collaborating and believe that the regulatory hurdles are actually not unsurmountable. The regulators have actually been quite supportive with giving breakthrough therapy designations to many compounds in development. I think what we are focused on is actually building on the success of Spravato as ketamine. So there are now more than 5,000 or 4,500 healthcare providers that are certified to deliver that therapy. They're on a run rate to achieve more than $1 billion in sales. So that is kind of the critical infrastructure that we want to leverage to also achieve access to innovation in the case of, in our case, psychedelic compounds at scale.
Maybe if I may, just to... So I think I agree with what Florian has said. The Lykos debacle was clearly an absolute disaster for them. And that was really unfortunate. It caused a huge amount of noise in the system. You probably, saw kind of floods of, really unhelpful news articles that hit your Facebook pages or Twitter or whatever, right? But it was also really helpful, I think, right, Florian? Because what it did was it set the parameters and the guardrails for what every other company coming next really would have to follow. So it was very, very clear, and it is now very, very clear what the key pressure points are going to be when you submit similar compound to the FDA, it is now really clear that they are going to ask you some serious questions about functional unblinding. It's really clear that they're going to ask you about the ethical conduct of your therapist if you have a therapeutic component, and so on and so forth. And so what I've been trying to say in the kind of the broader sphere is, yes, it may have been unhelpful for Lycos previously maps, but actually for the benefit of the broader sector, somebody had to go first. And now at least we know that we are actually playing basketball and not, football or rugby, which, we weren't terribly clear on before.
I agree. And maybe that's a good cue for my next question regarding if you look at the entirety of the psychedelics development pipeline compared to the overall R&D pipeline for pharma, what do you expect or envisage that perspective to look like down the road? Like that's going to take on it to become more significant?
I mean, look, as a proportion of the overall R&D pipeline in pharma, this is negligible. I mean, I don't think it would even make a rounding error. But what is really interesting about it is the plethora of different compounds. Óscar's already been talking about the difference between the so-called first versus second versus third generation types of molecules and compounds that we see coming through, and the different combinations, the different formulations, whether it's oral, buccal films, IV, or whatever it is. So there really is a huge amount of innovation across a number of different dimensions, which I think is really interesting. Similarly, a lot of innovation in the kinds of indications, as Florian was talking about. It is absolutely the case that mental health is foremost. So almost certainly we will get an approval for some version of psilocybin with some version of depression. I think we would all agree, probably TRD and probably Compass coming first. We will almost certainly eventually get MDMA or ecstasy for PTSD. And then as Florian has also been talking about, probably extensions into MDD, other kinds of depression, extensions into eating disorders and so on and so forth. And then also into the broader neurospace as well. And of course addictions, as Florian's mentioned. But as a proportion of the overall pharma R&D pipeline, it's still quite small. I think there are probably 70 or 80 different programs in development between phase 2 and 3, or sorry, phase 1 to 3, probably.
Writ large in Europe,
large.
depression.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's probably right, something like that.
Great, no, I agree. Despite the need is so huge, let's hope that we can address those needs and reach the patients. And I think that's also where I'd like to go in the third step of our conversation. And Óscar, question for you, because I think we talk about the role of the patient in psychedelic therapies being a totally different one from how patients are taking a pill today. So maybe you could elaborate on how your views and what actually the challenges are behind this.
I have like 3 ideas. One is that the use of psychedelics in clinical settings have shown us that the limits of the medical office stop us from getting a better outcome. No? So we need to rethink the physical aspect of the intervention itself. We need to think in the training of the professionals. For us, it's very important that the professionals do have an experience by themselves, even though this can be tricky to say some places, but this is not any normal medication. This is a medication that affects to how we perform as humans, not only as a healed person. So it's very important to be properly trained. It's very important to think the physical limits of the intervention. And at the same time, it brings us to think of the roots of these mental health problems, because even though we can say this is an individual problem that some persons have with their brain, we know that most of the times this is something that comes from the structural society the inequality. It comes from very concrete situations of violence during the childhood of the people. So it's the community is always involved in mental health. So we have to, again, see how psychedelics were used for centuries, and it has been always in community. The indigenous tribes that have used this knowledge have done it always in community. So we are not learning about new medicines, we are learning about how to rethink we do approach mental health, how the professionals approach mental health, and how, at the end of the day, the community has to be involved to get a better outcome. So that's why psychedelics itself are not like a silver bullet that will cure all mental health. That's why we think that psychedelic-assisted therapy it will be more effective rather than thinking in the same terms that bring us to this situation. No? So it's an opportunity to learn again how we can do it better in many aspects.
Thank you. And maybe touching base on that psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, maybe Florian, question to you in terms of when you develop those research programs, how do you approach actually the therapy pathway that the patient will have to undergo? Is that something that you link in your research programs, or do you approach it?
Yeah, I think it's slightly, a bit related to what you said and also learning from L.E.K. So what L.E.K. tried to do, so we are drug developers, our goal is to convince the regulators to approve our drug and kind of deliver, equip them with the data requisite to make their decision whether the benefits outweigh the risks. Right? So, and I think what L.E.K. did is they tried to get it approved, a drug therapy combination approved, and therapy is not in the purview of the regulators. So the FDA doesn't regulate therapy; they regulate drugs, and that's what if we think learning, are very much focused on since the beginning is how do you get this drug approved, and the way that we think about it is more providing psychological support via high-intense therapy. I think that the real world will decide how it will ultimately be delivered, but in our perspective, again, J&J and Spravato is a very good precedence here. So we are trying to kind of follow their footsteps in a way, tweak our molecules, as I said earlier, to fit into that 2-hour window. So to allow the healthcare providers to have also more patients per day. So if you have LSD, it's a very, very long trip. You might have 2 shifts. It's very cumbersome to actually implement that in the healthcare system. So we are focusing on a duration of 2 hours-ish, which is much more scalable and viable for the healthcare system. And we're also looking at, actually with our compounds, to have much, or the aim is to get a much more durable effect than what you get with Spravato or esketamine, so that you have to go less frequently into the office. So for esketamine, it's, I think it's 12 times over the first 8 weeks that you have to go to the doctor's office, and then as needed. What we see with some of the early data of our trials, also with DMT and 5-MeO-DMT, that you can really get durable efficacy out to 12 weeks. So you might be able to dose less frequent than with what's currently approved. So that's how we're thinking about it, to allow like larger access.
Thank you so much. Adrienne, you wanted to?
Look, there's a huge debate in this sector, a philosophical debate, I would say, about whether or not you need the psychotherapy or psychological support, and whether it really adds anything or not. And truly, the evidence is out. There are some on one side of the debate that will tell you, as Óscar has outlined, from an anthropological perspective, indigenous communities all over the world have imbibed or ingested these substances in the context of supportive social environments, which mimic, to a greater or larger extent, some kind of psychological, the word psychological support as we think about it in our Western way. But there were plenty of others, some of whom I think Florian have invested in, who think that actually maybe the way that the drug works in the brain through kind of improving plasticity means that actually you might not need, or you might be able to still have, so someone knowledgeable in the audience, we might not need to have that level of support, or we might be able to induce some kind of an effect. And truly, the evidence is, or the jury is out. We need more evidence.
You mentioned investors, and I know you just came back from the Jefferies conference.
Yeah.
Talked to many investors. It's psychedelic companies are not an easy value proposition. So can you just give us an insight on how investors approach?
Well, I'll certainly defer to Florian in a moment. But essentially, you have sort of 2 or 3 different categories of investors in this space. You have, let's call them folks who have had a personal connection one way or another, either themselves or their families. They've actually taken some of these medicines and had a really positive experience. They happen to have some family money and they invest. That I would say is the first category. Second category are more generalist kinds of investors. And then third, I think more recently have been more the specialist kinds through, and this is to do with the vagaries of mostly US biotech funding. But maybe I defer to Florian, who knows this space better than me.
No, I think that's spot on. I think important to, I mean, it's in line with this, we're running out. And, and yes, the stigma is fading. So we couldn't raise really in the 2017, 2018 from the traditional biotech, or very few were courageous enough to risk their reputation to be a first mover in this field. Because again, back then it was even much more stigmatized than it is today. I think the stigma is fading. And that is a result of the data that has been generated over time. And I think that's the currency that we need to use with all stakeholders to, and you said the jury is out, but like to basically ultimately deliver the data to allow us to get those substances approved, ultimately access to patients, and for us also really important to achieve reimbursed therapies.
Thank you very much. I think we are running out of time. I hope we could give everyone a sense of how the stigma is actually fading. And thank you so much to my dear panelists for their expert answers. And I'd like to leave the audience with a fantastic quote I found from Dr. Stanislav Grof talking about psychiatry, saying that psychedelics would be for psychiatry what the microscope is for biology and medicine, or the telescope for the astronomy.
Let's
so
hope.
I think, let's hope for that. Thank you so much.